So hello and welcome to the Anti-Corruption and Good Governance session here at the Making Global Goals Local Business Africa Regional event. I am Ayatollah Jagun, and for the next hour, we will be discussing Making Global Goals Local Business Africa. This is the Anti-Corruption Breakout session on collective action against corruption. I'm looking forward to this robust conversation. Before I introduce the panel, just a few housekeeping notes for those at home. Please feel free to pose your questions in session chat, and we will be sure to get to as many of those as we can. You can also continue the conversation on social media using the hashtag Global Goals Local Business. And remember that a recording of today's session will be available on the UN Global Compact's YouTube page following the event, as well as available on podcast and UN Radio in the coming weeks. Stay tuned for more information on those channels in the coming weeks. Now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our panel for today. I would start off by introducing Mr. Samuel Kimil, who is a board member, African Union Advisory Board on Corruption. Mr. Kimil is the Executive Director of Africa's Voices Foundation, AVF. He previously served as the Executive Director, Transparency International Kenya from 2010 to 2020, and the Kenyan section of the International Commission from 2005 to 2006. He was a specialist at the Embassy of Finland in Nairobi from 2007 to 2010, and taught law at the University School of Law in Nairobi, Kenya from 2009 to 2010. Can I ask everyone to mute their phones? Can you please mute? Thank you very much. Can you please mute your phone, please? Thank you. Thank you. He is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and holds a Master of Laws degree in International Human Rights from the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, USA. He received his Bachelor of Law degree from the University of Nairobi. He is a member of both the Law Society of Kenya and the East African Law Society. Mr. Kimil has just completed his 3-year term as an elected member of the International Board of Transparency International. He is currently serving a 2-year term as an elected member of the African Union Advisory Board on Corruption. I'd like to go on to also introduce Cecilia Muller who is Executive Director of BSR's Maritime Anti-Corruption Network. Cecilia Muller was one of the front drivers for Mscn's establishment in 2011. Under Cecilia's leadership, the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network has grown significantly, won multiple awards, and is considered one of the preeminent examples of collective action to tackle corruption. Prior to joining BSR, Cecilia built more than 8 years of compliance and shipping experience as Senior Compliance Officer in the Mscn Group. She has been responsible for anti-corruption efforts globally, trained management and staff worldwide, implemented whistleblowing systems, rolled out country-specific anti-corruption campaigns, and conducted risk assessments, audits, and misconduct investigations. In 2015, she was awarded Compliance Officer of the Year by the C5 Women in Compliance Awards. And Cecilia sits on the International Advisory Board for the Port Efficiency and Public-Private Capacity in Ghana, and is guest lecturer at the World Maritime University. She speaks English and Swedish and holds a Master of Laws from Lund University in Sweden. I'd also like to go on to introduce A.L. Kitenge, who is CEO of Task Force DRC. He trained at the Polytechnic School of Lubumbashi. Al Kitenge made his first career as a chemical engineer with a multinational Unilever in Africa and Europe. And then thanks to his skills in economics and organization, he turned to consulting and support for innovation. The entrepreneur who divides his time between London and Kinshasa now intends to devote his skills to the development of the solidarity economy sector, convinced that the living conditions of the populations are not sufficiently taken into account in the development projects advocated by the Western nations and international institutions. He's an expert in innovation, governance, and public policies, and holds an MBA in economic strategies. He has been a serial entrepreneur for the last 20 years, and thanks to his multiple skills, he is currently a coach for major decision makers. Last but not least, I would like to introduce John Gumi from Kenya Pipeline Company. Mr. John Gumi has over 35 years of corporate and investment banking experience, and recently retired as head of investment banking for the Standard Bank Group in East Africa. During his career, John has worked variously for Barclays Bank, Citibank, Grindlays Bank, National Westminster Bank, and Standard Bank Group. He also co-founded Loiter Capital Partners Group, one of Africa's first locally owned independent investment banks. In the financial sector, Mr. Gumi has been at the forefront of the development of financial markets, products and services, and of the accompanying regulatory frameworks in Kenya and East Africa. He was also critical in the most significant debt and equity transactions. Mr. Gumi has served on the board of ARM Cement Limited, Base Titanium Limited, and Eagle Africa Capital Partners Limited. In addition, he has served on the boards of critical government entities such as the Kenya Airways Limited, and is the immediate former chairman of the Kenya Pipeline Company Limited. So we have, as you can see, we have a robust and knowledgeable panel of speakers and panelists. I would like to hand on now to Mr. Samuel Kimeo to give his keynote speech. Mr. Kimeo, over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Ayatola, for the invitation. I am delighted this morning to make these few remarks at this important session. And I want to thank the organizers for the invitation. The theme for the session is apt: Uniting Business for Africa. We want decade of action and opportunities. I thank the conveners of this breakout session on collective action against corruption. I also make note that anti-corruption is one of the 4 areas of focus for the UN Global Compact. Corruption is indeed one of the foremost issues we have to deal with on the African continent. The African Union Convention on Combating and Preventing Corruption is itself a recognition that corruption is an issue that requires to be addressed. But what is corruption? There are many definitions. I will go with that of Transparency International, which defines corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. At the root of this definition are 4 concepts: power, trust, abuse, and gain. They summarize the elements of corruption, whether as a criminal offense or an ethical infraction, whether in public, private, or in the society. Corruption therefore includes, but is not limited to, bribery, extortion, cronyism, nepotism, patronage, influence peddling, graft, embezzlement. It is also a facilitator of many criminal enterprises. Why should we be concerned about corruption, one may ask? What does the private sector have to do with it? Corruption distorts markets, undermines competition, and increases cost of doing business. The private sector, being that part of the economy in private hands or companies, needs a properly regulated market that yields to the forces of the market. Corruption therefore undermines the very foundation for a thriving private sector. It also erodes the trust we have in the public sector to act in our best interests. Taxes and rates are wasted thus undermining the ability of the state to provide quality basic goods and services. It is therefore easy to see why it is good business to fight corruption and refrain from engaging in it. Anyone observing the African continent will notice that the private sector is not an innocent victim of corruption, but a key driver. A quick scan of all the cases of corruption reported in the media, or those that are under investigation, or even in our courts, bear witness to this. They tend almost always to involve a private party, either a citizen or a company, that pays or promises to pay money to a public party, in this case, a politician or a public official, in order to obtain an advantage that they do not deserve or avoid a disadvantage rightfully and legally deserved. This twinning of the public and the private in driving corruption implies that both sectors must be at the core of any effort to fight corruption. In other words, we need collective action against corruption if we are to succeed. African governments and states have recognized this prerequisite to effective fight against corruption. In the preamble to the African Convention on Combating and Preventing Corruption, member states underscored their determination to build partnerships between governments and all segments of civil society, media, and the private sector in order to fight the scourge of corruption. SDG 17 now affirms this basic tenet in effectively eradicating corruption. The private sector, therefore, needs to work together with the public sector and the civil society, as well as the media, for their efforts to succeed. The private sector is particularly well placed to play a critical part in fighting corruption. Its efficiency and concentration of expertise of all kind is easy to acknowledge. On a continent where economic growth is vital for the welfare of the people, private sector associations tend to have an ear of the political leadership. A number of countries have executive private sector platforms that are used to address issues affecting businesses. Corruption has been a subject of discussion and action on such fora. On the other hand, enforcement of compliance has significantly improved. The consequences of engaging in corruption are dire and are increasingly being better enforced. Since 2014, foreign regulators have become more efficient across all regions. And as a result, companies are getting more proactive in fighting corruption as a good to be pursued in itself, but also as a means of avoiding sanctions. Let me now reflect a little bit on what the private sector can do to support the fight against corruption. There are 5 main ways of doing this, and I can add that they are all in use on the continent. The first is due diligence. Companies exist in an interconnected web of vendors, contractors, partners, acquisitions, among other business relationships. By effectively carrying out due diligence on their relations, they not only avoid those tainted by corruption, but put business pressure for those who value the relationship to gravitate towards greater integrity. Secondly is compliance. The private sector is now subject to many laws and regulations that they have to abide with in order to continue doing their businesses successfully. They should set up competent units and functions that carry out sophisticated risk assessments and management to stay on the right side of the law. Thirdly is to monitor those risks. This entails monitoring risk for compliance with anti-corruption laws, including identifying high-risk activities or transactions. And this can be a periodic or continuous undertaking. Fourth is the reporting and investigation. Companies should keep in place a program of receiving reports on allegations of corruption within its ranks. This should include a whistleblower protection program that protects those who come forward to report corruption within the company. It should also evaluate and investigate allegations of corruption reported or suspected and take enforcement action. Finally is collaboration. Companies should work together in sector and umbrella private sector associations to increase their leverage to advocate for more responsive markets, including action against corruption. They should also link up with government and the civil society to work out programs of action to promote ethics and integrity in business and society at large, including demanding action for those who engage in corruption, be they in the private or the public sector. I will now reflect on the role of the African Union Advisory Board on corruption and its relationship with the private sector. The UABC is established under Article 22 as a follow-up mechanism of the Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption, and its mandate includes to promote and encourage adoption and application of anti-corruption measures on the continent, to collect and document information on the nature and scope of corruption and related offenses, as well as develop methodologies for analyzing the nature and extent of corruption on the continent, and to also advise governments on how to deal with the scourge of corruption and related offenses. The board has often engaged with the private sector during state review missions through interactions with the chambers of commerce and industry in the various member states. It should, however, be noted that it's not always that the private sector is present on the table during these events. There is a case, therefore, to be made for a more focused engagement between the board and the business community. At the moment, there is no specific tool or mechanism developed by the board for purposes of engaging with the business sector, even though the convention makes the case for the board's engagement with the sector. Perhaps it's now time to commence discussions towards developing modalities for this engagement. The areas of work and focus for the board are of direct relevance to the private sector, and these are mainly public procurement policy and legal frameworks. Because licensing, taxation, and procurement are some of the most important points of interaction between the private sector and the state. The focus of the AUABC on procurement is informed by the role procurement of goods and services and the disposal of public assets plays in the state of corruption on the continent. Procurement malpractice accounts for about 30% of all resources lost to corruption on the continent. During our review missions as a board, we focus on efforts by states to determine whether procurement laws and framework allow for private sector to report corruption, whether national anti-corruption laws make provisions for measures to be taken against private sector players involved in corruption, whether there is legislation that regulates the behavior of companies in the private sector, whether there is legislation that provides for accountability and auditing standards, whether there is legislation that regulates competition. We have also focused on laws around bank secrecy. The focus here being whether there are established financial intelligence units and how they work with the private sector alongside law enforcement to rein in money laundering and illicit financial flows. This last point has become a lot more prominent lately due to the work of the high-level panel on illicit financial flows, which was chaired by His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, former president of South Africa. This panel, as you know, produced a report aptly named Track It, Stop It, Get It. This report, having examined in detail the cost of illicit financial flows on the continent, called upon African states to focus on reining in illicit financial flows out of the continent as part of the determination to ensure Africa's accelerated and sustained development, relying as much as possible on its own resources. The role of mining on the continent, the sector's reputation over the years has also necessitated a focus on whether there are laws and regulations that require companies to publish what they pay. The board has also worked on the beneficial ownership transparency. The African Union included beneficial ownership in the Nouakchott Declaration on the African Anti-Corruption Year. Member states have committed to establishing open and accessible beneficial ownership registers, engage in country-by-country reporting, and participate in automatic exchange of tax information. In conclusion, therefore, the private sector is both a victim and a driver of corruption. A collaborative, collective effort that brings together the public sector,
I think we've lost Mr. Kimeo, frozen a bit, but hello, Mr. Kimeo.
Together with the private.
Let's see.
Yes, I was just saying that a collaborative effort that brings together the public sector, the business sector, civil society, and media is necessary to effectively fight corruption on the continent. The AUABC is committed to exploring, together with the private sector, modalities for effective engagement in the fight against corruption in Africa, because together we can and we will defeat corruption. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kimeo, for a very insightful keynote speech. It's really pleasing to hear you talk about the role of the media, particularly in the fight of corruption against corruption in Africa, and to see the efforts being made by the ABC on corruption in Africa across the various member states. One thing that I note from your speech is the need for more focused engagement between the board and the private sector. And that is key, particularly in the areas of public procurement and in terms of legal framework and policy. I think that is happening to a very large extent in member states. But I think when the AU comes together, it's important from a point of view of the AU to have that engagement across the various member states, rather than it just happening locally within each member state. I think that would be very, very key to the regional integration that we seek to accomplish so much across Africa. So thank you so much for your speech, very insightful and very thoughtful, and for the work that you are doing on the board, on the advisory board on corruption. Thank you, sir. I'm going to move swiftly on in the interest of time to the discussion with the panelists. And Cecilia, I'll just start with you. You are an experienced anti-corruption specialist and have been responsible for anti-corruption efforts globally. But as we explained also in the introduction, you also serve as the chair of the Maritime Anti-Corruption Group, Anti-Corruption Network. Which is a global business network of over 130 companies working together to tackle corruption in the maritime industry. And you also work as a collective action lead in the Mscn steering committee. I just wanted to ask you, first of all, what is your view? What in your view is the case for anti-corruption collective action? And why is it so critical to effectively combating corruption in Africa?
Yes, thank you so much, Edra, and thank you and Global Compact for inviting me, including, of course, Kenya, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Nigeria. Just a small correction, since 2017, I'm actually working as an executive director for Mscn. So just to note, I'm not a part of the steering committee. I'm actually left my in-house job to work with this full-time since 2017, because I'm a true passionate for collective action in terms of tackling corruption. So just want to make that small clarification, but thank you again for having me. Yes, so I would like to bring in the private sector perspective here a bit. So just 1 minute on the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network. 90% of all the cargo today is transported on board the ships, right? So, and the shipping industry is very exposed to corruption in the sense that they operate in multiple jurisdictions. They can be in one country one day and another country the next day. We have frequent and multiple government interactions. So when the vessel enters into the ports, the vessel actually have to meet with a lot of different departments as per international standards. And we're heavily regulated. It's a very heavily regulated industry. So in that sense, you know, there is a lot of challenges and a lot of culture and a lot of tradition that shipping industry kind of have to adhere to. So, and I also have an in-house perspective. I used to work as an in-house compliance officer, and I was in front of all these frontline captains and seafarers who are confronted with some of these issues. And there are three questions that keep coming back. And it's funny because I'm not sure it's funny, but it's super relevant because I've been training a lot of other companies in my time as Mscn. And there are three questions that keep coming back is that if we say no and everybody else says yes, what are the consequences from that? So what is our competition doing about this? I think that is the first question anyone who is in front of these problems will ask its respective employer, right? What's governments doing about this agenda? And they are not only mentioned, I mean, and there are two governments here that I think is important to address. There are the government that has very strict extraterritorial laws and are enforcing those. How are they supporting companies who are faced with these challenges on the ground? What is the support mechanism for having very strict regulations? And at the same time, if you have a company operating in a company, knocking on the door of these companies, on these governments, help us to solve these issues. Where's the support? And then secondly, of course, where is the work that's doing for governments where corruption is a problem, right? And then secondly, we've been doing this for so many years. How can we change the world? And I think that's, in order to be very practical, you have to be able to address those questions. Otherwise, you will sit with a policy that is not fully believed in or endorsed when you actually, and that doesn't matter which industry you're in. That's the same, right? You need to empower the people who are faced with these risks, and you need to find good ways of doing that. And that was kind of the background for Mscn, that we got 8 companies together in a room saying, could we gain by collaborating as an industry? Could we have an industry voice in this? And that was in 2010 and 2011. And I do think that Mr. Samuel's comment around, what are the incentives for government? I do think the UK Bribery Act actually played a very big role because there was all this communication around extraterritorial enforcement, very strict laws. So I do think a lot of companies were refreshed in their thinking and how are we actually operating globally. And today we're 140 companies. Actually, we've grown. We represent around 50% of the market in shipping. You mentioned that in tonnage, so 50% of the world's tonnage. So we have a real industry voice now, which I think is also a fantastic journey to be in, of course. So that's why, when you talk about collective action, it's so interesting. Like, what is collective action? Collective action is, of course, getting industry, the private sector together, as we've done. But for us, collective action also get, both the supply and the demand side of corruption. So you get the private sector and the public sector to work together. And I think unless we want to succeed, this is the only way, in my book, to solve this, as you get both government representative and the private sector working together. And that's something we've been successful in doing in multiple countries, including Nigeria. But I think it's important to kind of understand the questions that the private sector is bringing forward, and frontline, the ones, those you really need to feel, you need to support, and you need to empower, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That's good. Thank you so much for that. And I want to ask the next question of A.L. Kintenge. You gave a profound TEDx UQ talk speech. It's on YouTube for those who want to listen to it, in 2018, on why leaders fail in Africa. And you said that failed leadership in Africa is admittedly marred by corruption. My question to you is, why have most anti-corruption reforms in Africa seem to have failed? And what, in your view, are the key factors attributable to such failed anti-corruption programs or initiatives in Africa? What can we do to ensure that collective action anti-corruption projects do not fail? Mr. Kitenge. Please unmute, sir.
Thank you. My point. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
Oh.
We do need to see you. Thank you.
Can you see me now?
No, not at all. But I mean, if we can, if we can just respond to the question, then I think we can
The
try and
camera
fix
is on.
that. Yeah, we can't see you at all. It's quite dark. But I mean, if you could maybe just go on to answer the question, and we can try and look at that later on. Hello, sir. Can you hear me? Okay. Perhaps you could maybe try and log back in again. I'll just move on to Mr. Gumi. John Gumi, you during an interview with the Standard in July of this year, you were quoted as saying that as a board, we are aware.
I'll change the position. I'll change the position.
The beauty of modern technology. Okay, wonderful. So, Ms. Ngumi, thank you very much. So, you mentioned that.
Am I clear?
Hello, sir.
I can hear you, sir, ma'am.
Okay, please go ahead. You can go ahead, sir. We can't see you, but you can still go ahead and if you can just go ahead and respond to the question so that we don't have such a long interruption. Okay. I think I'm so sorry. We're going to have to move on. In the interest of time, I'm just going to move on to Mr. Ngumi. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for your patience. So you were quoted as saying in July of this year that, as a board, you're aware that the long-term solution to combating corruption and other financial malfeasance lies in having robust systems that will deter wrongdoing and swiftly unearth any occurrence. Practically, though, how can corporates enhance sustainable, accountable, and transparent business practices in Africa beyond just a culture of compliance in-house? And from your experiences in your various roles within the financial services sector in the region, what lessons can we glean? What would you be willing to share with us as to how we can practically make an impact when it comes to anti-corruption?
Thank you, Ayatollah. Let me start with a bit of background. When I was asked to participate in this, I was dubious at first. And Mr. Kimeu, who's Kenyan and lives in Kenya, will know why I was dubious, because I have been at the heart of the beast, so to speak, chairing the board of a company that epitomized public sector corruption. And I told Judy I couldn't see what I could possibly add to a panel of experts in anti-corruption, but she insisted that it would be good to hear from the sharp end how we have combated this. Now, Kenya Pipeline, whose board I chaired until August, is very much akin to NNPC in Nigeria or Transnet Eskom in South Africa. State companies with lots and lots and lots of cash flow. And lots of cash flow attract lots and lots of interest and attract lots and lots of people. Kenya Pipeline was particularly notorious for being the leading bleeder of cash to politicians and others. And to your question about my quotation, let me put it into context.
Yes.
We had been engaged in a severe, furious battle for 3 years to combat ingrained corruption at Kenya Pipeline. And looking at the fight, looking at the resistance, looking at the bare knuckled efforts that were made to stop us having an impact. The following, really, I'll follow Mr. Kime's example and look at 4 or 5 things that I felt have worked, and then go on to your question. One is that in the public sector, there is no question that if you don't have leadership at the very top of the institution, a leadership prepared to step out, it will not work. Then that leadership has to be backed up, and that's the second point, by high-level commitment. Unfortunately, what I have experienced and what I know my colleagues have experienced in trying to do the same is that all the laws don't matter if there is no call it the air cover from the political and bureaucratic classes. Air cover, either active or air cover that is passive in that it will not be used against you. Which leads to a third quality called resilience. If you don't have resilience and staying power, you are dead. And the resilience is not easy. I mean, I don't know whether Mr. Kimeu is a follower of Kenya's very vibrant social media, but I have, for 4 or 5 years, I was a daily subject of the most extraordinary stories, all meant to break my determination to change this. Fourth and most heartening is that while some in Kenya say that corruption is ingrained right from the top to the bottom, one heartening thing that I have come across in KPC and other public sector entities is that beneath the top layer of management, who have their sponsors, there is a layer of people who actually do want to do a good job, but very feel that for whatever reason, I suspect it's because we are a very hierarchical society across Africa. They feel that they dare not step out unless the leadership of the institution steps out and gives them the room, the airtime, the breathing space, both to expose what is happening and secondly, to put in place systems. Now, coming back to systems, which was your question, what we found out is that if we consistently applied the same standards in judging people, sooner or later, it became the standard of the company. Number two, if we as a board, or to be more honest, if I as chair of the board did not and was not seen to participate in any activity within the company, and regardless of what their media says, people in the company know who is doing what. They feel there is a feeling that things can be done differently, and that I can now walk around town wearing my Kenya Pipeline T-shirt without feeling embarrassed. Third is we've publicized very heavily the outcome of the results of, or rather the outcomes of the drive to do things right. By that, I mean that for a company, for instance, that hadn't paid any dividend for heaven knows how long, to end up paying a dividend of close to $200 million in the space of 1 year drives home a message both to the public and to the people within that it can be done. And in terms of culture, I've been out of Kenya Pipeline now for 5 months, but it's still the culture of we are a pillar of Kenya. We are proud. We have shown we can do it. Has been carried forward by the board that took over after I left. Of course, we've put up all the compliance systems that Mr. Kibero was describing. Unfortunately, and I think this is what our colleagues in DRC was going to answer, and hopefully will answer. All those systems have not mattered if, one, the CEOs and others in the institution don't obey them, because when I was in banking, the compliance officers were independent entities who reported weight to the board and to the regulators and whoever. They were immensely powerful. In the public sector, which has it, and I believe this goes for all African countries, in the public sector, which has its rules, the rules are very clearly defined. And even though we have rules in Kenya which say that compliance is an internal audit function, which is which reports directly to the board and therefore can go around management, what we forget is that boards are not competitively hired. They are also tools of patronage. And so I'm afraid, and I'm hoping I'm wrong, and one thing I wanted to learn this afternoon is what others are doing. I am afraid that I believe we are still at that stage in Kenya where it will take time for systems to embed themselves, which is why I used that phrase, and that the individuals really and truly matter, which the individuals at the top, which accounts for the fact that increasingly government is reaching out to private sector leaders to come and chair the boards of public sector entities in a bid to transplant best practice. So in a long and roundabout way, that is what I meant, that it would take time because the challenges which we face in these large public sector entities are really immense, and do call for a few brave men and women to stand out and start enforcing the things that should be enforced and are not being enforced.
Thank you so much, sir. You've spoken so eloquently about the challenges of a CEO operating in Africa. I always say one thing, that I believe CEOs in Africa are grossly underpaid because of the amount of work and stress that is upon them as they navigate not just the running of their businesses on a day-to-day basis, but being even able to deal with government entities in a straightforward and a manner, in a straightforward manner, and in a way that where they do not compromise. It takes a lot. You know, I'm based in Nigeria, and a CEO can not only just focus on their day-to-day, they have to go before the houses of legislature and respond to questions that really should be left to the heads of the MDAs to answer. They have to engage the regulators on a day-to-day basis. They are also trying to ensure that they get licenses to be able to run their businesses. And it is a lot of work, and it's a lot of stress, particularly for those who want to do things the right way. At the same time, you are battling your shareholders. And unfortunately, because of the manner in which a lot of large corporates have evolved, the fact that you have hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of retail shareholders holding, small amounts of your shares, you still have to make them happy. Then you're battling with the media, you're battling with competition, and it is quite a lot of burden on any CEO running a public company or a public utilities company in Africa. And so you talk about the right things, the tone from the top, the commitment of government to protect companies and CEOs that want to do the right thing. That is so key. And then the resilience of the company who wants to do the right thing where others in the same industry are not necessarily doing the right thing. And that is where collective action comes in. That's the beauty of collective action, that corporates can come together to force each other to kind of like maintain that level playing field on the one hand, and then also work with governments to say, you know what, these are the policies that need to be put in place to ensure that that level playing field is maintained, whether it's in the area of procurement, whether it's in the area of licensing, whatever the case may be. So very, very similar situations, I'm sure in Kenya, in Congo, in DRC, in Nigeria as well. I'm going to move on to AL Kitenge. Thank you so much for joining us. And I just want to ask you, in the President develop a plan for Africa in order to decide where we want to go. So it is now clear that collective action of partnering for the goals, which is SDG 17, is the renewed global strategy to combat corruption in businesses. But how do we, in your view, how do we plan for Africa? How can we effectively explore collaborative mechanisms with the African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption? And how can we build that nascent anti-corruption collective action model for Africa? Mr. Kitenge, you're on mute. You need to unmute your phone. Oh. Oh dear. Hello? Absolutely cannot hear you now. I'm going to go back to you, Cecilia, and just ask a slightly different question, because you've been working with the Mscn initiative with the in Nigeria, expanding with the support of the Siemens Integrity Initiative.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate it. It's very, very well to be here and to do.
Please continue. We can't hear you now. I'm just going to move on, Cecilia. So the project is being implemented with the Convention on Business Integrity, a friend of mine, Sojia Pampa, and will run from 2020 up to January 2023. Can you share some of the practical successes, challenges, and opportunities learned from this initiative?
Can you hear me now?
Another similar initiatives that you may have implemented in other countries. So how do you think the challenges you have mentioned also should be addressed? How can we address some of those challenges? What are the practical challenges, successes, and opportunities to collective action initiatives, particularly focusing on the Mscn's and the Siemens Integrity Initiative?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello. Hello, Mr. Kitenge, we can't hear you at the moment. We will come back to you. I just asked.
I was saying that it's very.
We honestly cannot hear you.
Important to see.
Okay, sorry, Cecilia.
Okay, yes, no. I know it's stress when the internet connection's not working as a moderator. I feel for you, but that's a challenge also for the speaker. I'm sorry to hear that. So yes, absolutely. Let's talk a bit about Nigeria. So I think part of our success in our methodology is that, when you speak about Africa, it's a huge continent, like different, countries, governance, cultures, priorities. And for us working in Copenhagen, there's no way we can be experts of Africa or of the world, I would say, in total. So we have like a methodology that we have adapted now in numerous countries like Argentina, Indonesia, India, Nigeria. And we have learned a lot from our flagship, which was actually Nigeria. And first of all, I think what's really important here in highlights to that our local partners here, Sotia Pampa from CBI in Nigeria, I mean, and other partners working in countries, that they are the experts. They are the ones that we rely on. How do we position the issue of corruption in the right way so we get to a constructive dialogue, right? What is the right format? What is the right tone? What is the right, who do we go to? So I would say that I say our local partners, these are local heroes, because they're the ones that we bring industry challenges, so we know, what type of issues are we faced with, how often, what's the severity of those risks, because we have these companies that kind of tells these stories. And one instrumental tool we have is Mscn's incident reporting mechanism. So companies report into us anonymously when they've been faced with a corrupt demand. And we have 40,000 cases now, over 40,000 cases of global demands. And the demand, you can debate data for centuries, and the demand, when is it become a demand? But we don't use that data to blame and shame governments. We use that data to kind of point out there are systemic issues in these ports covering these type of dealings. It could be immigration, depending what it is. And then that's a door opener for us, because then it's up to the government to say, okay, let's work with the industry here and to do more root cause analysis, trying to really take a deep dive into. And that is our way, in a sense, to say, we should not tell you what to do, right? Because you are a government, we operate in your jurisdiction, but we kind of poke you as much as possible because we really see there's something that's not right here. And by having that international industry voice of both big companies, but also small companies who are very much like sweating, and local port agents who operate in the country, by having that diverse voice, it's actually been quite hard for governments to kind of move away. So when we started with Nigeria, which was kind of interesting, we were, I think, around 20 companies. And I'm going to be honest, without naming and shaming everybody asked us, everybody who I spoke to, because I was leading Nigeria and the first few years, the first question I got, like, why Nigeria? Even after people, coming from different countries, like neighboring countries in Africa, they would say, why Nigeria? Like, of every country. And I guess we didn't have a better answer, but we said, if we can nail things there in such a, global economy, such a big country, then we can do it anywhere. So I guess we were kind of like, we don't exactly know. There's no handbook on how to do this. We can't just go in and read and just like, this is how we do things. So we were kind of like learning and we were daring to do that. We were daring to pilot different things. And then we had some basic methodology. We're not here to, again, name and shame. We are here to kind of get the government to work with us. And we were able to tap into their priorities. And I think this is one of the biggest learnings I would like to share around the world, that we all know corruption is bad. We have to stop being in this bubble that corruption is bad. We have to start getting practical and constructive. And I think that's a strength that we have learned, that, we need to understand, here are the issues for the industry. How does that relate to the government's priorities, right? Why should they work with us? And then the reason is not because corruption is bad, because they know that. Even corrupt officials you would speak to, they will know corruption is bad. This argument has been used for 15 years. But what we try to do is trying to tell them, because we have a sector approach. So we can say, dear government, we see these issues. We see it's actually having a detrimental effect on the trade. We know that in your country, you have a big prioritization to to improve trade flows or ease of doing business or whatever it can be, right? We're trying to tap it into, so the high level politicians who sits and actually design the program, the agenda for the national economy and from the national government, they can see that this is relevant. And I think that's, if I'm going to, say anything that I think it's so adaptable to in a global context, just in an African context, in a regional concept, is that needs to happen. Any private public sector dialogue needs to be more than just saying corruption is bad. Like, everybody knows the benefits of these companies, either developing or progressing into the country. And if that's not enough, you can always put the local story into it. Like, for us, it's easy because it's trade, right? But there is a local company or an SME that is in our book that is not getting the possibilities to expand as much as that company could have done because there are obstacles in the way they process their cargo or getting into the ports. And I think that could be applicable of any sector. You just have to know what those reasons are, right? So I guess the combination of pushing industry voice, international push, understanding the government's agenda, making this an incentive for them to work with us, also helping them to understand the challenges their local business is faced with, right? Like when I go to Nigeria and I hear those stories that, they're actually putting their cargo and traveling by truck 4 hours to go to Lagos because they don't dare to go to this port because they know their cost in terms of illicit payments is going to go up by 30%. That's not a great story, but it's a very relevant story for the government. And that's something I think for Mscn or any private sector dialogue, that's a responsibility we have to kind of give the government this story. And then we have been able to create incentives and a good cooperation. And I think I can quote we had the officials coming to our meeting last year, high representatives from Nigeria, and one of them said, we realize we need you as much as you need us. So we probably need you more because we want our trade to be expanded and have an international focus. So I think tapping into those arguments are so important to understand incentives in the whole dialogue. Besides good governance, I just want to add, like I totally agree with all the other speakers in terms of good governance and having compliance procedures. But if you're boiling down to how do you drive a collective action, you have to understand those incentives. I think those are, and local heroes. Like if you, and then again, I'm not saying here setting I know Africa. I love hearing all your perspectives to that and where you're coming from different countries. But I mean, we have to tap into that. Otherwise, we are not successful. And on the final note, I just want to say there are good people in every corrupt government in any country. You find these government officials, both on middle level and senior level, that is just understands this topic and are genuinely committed to change. So I think that shouldn't also be forgotten. There was like a lot of focus on, prosecuting, enforcement, investigation, and I think that's very, very good, and it should happen. But also in countries with, if you're putting the right arguments forward, there's a lot of appetite for change as well. So I think that's also extremely important. So just some learnings on. I'd be happy to speak about the practical and how we actually solve things, but I want to, maybe leave it open for some other speakers as well. You're on mute.
If we do have some time, we'll definitely come back to that. I think it's so interesting what you say about tapping into government priorities, looking at, for instance, mandate promises. As a business, this is what we do. You look at the government's election mandate promises, you look at their priorities in terms of deciding what your strategy is going to be as a business, but much more so when we're looking at anti-corruption initiatives as well. We have to look at what the high-level reporting mandates are for the government, whether it's in terms of the SDG goals, whether it's in terms of, anything to do with like proceeds of crime. What are the mandates? What are the priorities? And then make sure that we align ourselves with those. And so I think that is so key in terms of what you said, and also being proactive, being ready. We live in an ever-changing world. We've seen COVID-19. In Nigeria, we've seen the NSAS movement. It's been an amazing year. It's been an amazing year full of challenges, full of opportunities. And so I think that there's also an aspect of being ready to move.
Yes. Because
all of these challenges are going to have opportunities to be able to push forward an anti-corruption agenda. Yeah. With the NSAS movement, this is an opportunity to push forward the anti-corruption agenda when it comes to the police force. So what are the initiatives that are there that one can pick up and run with? One of the things that happened in September was that the president in Nigeria launched the National Ethics and Integrity Policy, which is a set of 7 core values by which all Nigerians, public, private sector, civil society, children in schools are supposed to live by. Now, the NSAS movement, those values talk about the right to, for instance, human dignity, integrity, voice and participation, professionalism, personal responsibility when it comes to things like social media, patriotism and unity. The NSAS movement challenged every single one of those core values in terms of what the government's response was and what the citizens' response was. This is an opportunity to start some collective action initiatives to be able to actually push the conversation forward and address those things. And I believe the same is true of Kenya, the same is true of the DRC, the same is true of so many other African countries where, the young people are agitating for change. People are agitating for change because we want a nation where we have access and to the wealth, where there's equal access, there's a cry for justice, and there's a cry for equity. So I think these present opportunities for collective action, but we have to be proactive and we have to also not rise above everything that is happening, rise above the circumstances, rise above the challenges to be able to prefer lasting solutions. I would like to, with that, Mr. Gumi, go back to you. And I'm actually going to ask you a question, which I think we had wanted to ask Cecilia, but which I think, from what you've said, you could really respond to. And that is to do with COVID-19 and the difficulties occasioned by the pandemic. How do we incentivize ethics and good governance at a time of great uncertainty, at a time where many are facing difficulties occasioned by COVID-19, at a time where there is great social agitation? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Mr. Gumi.
Talk about a tough question. But before I attempt to answer it, let me say, Cecilia, I was cheering inwardly when you were talking, because that you put in better words what I was trying to talk about, the practicality of getting things done and putting flesh to the philosophy and principles that Mr. Kimeu outlined. And appealing, so to speak, to the self-interest of the government. If there's a takeaway I have from this conversation, it's that you've got to find what they want in order. So in a sense, I've been doing it without having the theory. So what you've done is to put theory into what I have actually been practicing. COVID-19 in the public sector has been very interesting, and it's been very interesting because it has removed the veil from a lot of things that have been done and are now seen to be not necessary to be done. Let me give you classic examples. A lot of the petty corruption, which operates like a cancer in the public sectors, has gone. Your desire to hold endless conferences out of town or out of country, the desire to travel, the desire to buy new cars because you'll be driving out heaven knows where, the use of office for or the use of your physical official office to conduct your own private business. The working from home, the stay at home, the no travel policies have worked immense wonders. And I have a feeling that even as we make policy and try to impose that policy, the behavioral changes that COVID has brought to the public sector are going to be immense. The second thing that COVID has done, which I believe will help the anti-corruption drive, is the acceptance of technology, of digitalization. I spent, it wasn't until near the end of my tenure as chair of Kenya Pipeline that I managed to get the management actually to install video conferencing. The amount of excuses over 5 years were immense. The efficiencies that video conferencing have brought, again, are things that I think will help. The efficiency, not so much video conferencing, but the acceptance of technology are things that will shine light upon a lot of activities which no longer have places to hide. So let me leave my answer at that and say that suddenly, yes, it will be tough it'll be tough to prioritize anti-corruption policies in the context of all these other priorities. But really, deep down there, unseen, lots and lots of changes are happening, which are going to make it easier for the anti-corruption crusaders like Kimeu and Cecilia actually to get things done, because there is now an acceptance of new ways of doing the things.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I have a question for Mr. Kimeu. How can we effectively explore collaborative action mechanisms or collaborative mechanisms with the African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption? How can we build, and I know you touched on this in your keynote speech, but how can we build a nascent anti-corruption collective action model for Africa? How can we plan for Africa in light of, COVID-19, the social unrest that we're seeing? Mr. Kimeu.
Thank you very much, Ayatollah. And I have listened very keenly to what my colleagues have had to say on the panel. I think it's very illuminating. I think I'll just reiterate what I said earlier. The African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption actually envisages that the fight against corruption on the continent is going to be a collective agenda and singles out the private sector, the civil society and media, in addition, of course, to state parties as collaborators in ensuring the fight against corruption is effective on the continent. However, over the years, I think the engagement of the board has largely been with the states, and in state review missions that are carried out periodically by the board, we have opportunity to interact with the other sectors. Outside those review missions, we have worked out some modalities for engagement with civil society. We've done that for a couple of years now. But with the private sector, I think it is time for us to sit down and agree on how to have a modality of engagement between the private sector and the African Union Advisory Board on Corruption, as well as to create the collectivity of actors within the states. I would very much personally look forward to having the private sector engaged in a more robust manner in the affairs of the board and the African Union in the fight against corruption. And I think this conversation is a good starting point for us to build on to that possibility. Thank you. You're muted.
Final question to you, Cecilia. Thank you very much, Mr. Kimel. Thank you for reiterating that and also extending the invitation to the private sector to for more collaboration with the board. I was just going to ask Cecilia my final question to her. What would a clear roadmap be on how we can undertake, I mean, and you've spoken quite a bit to that, but if you were to give a roadmap on, and speak further on how we can undertake successful anti-corruption collective action in Africa, what would that roadmap be?
Yes, no, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I think if I would put, and I think alluded to some of the other question we talked about success, challenges, and opportunities. I think that, first of all, we need to go from policy to practice. I think that's one of the things we need to do on both sides. And this is, again, I'm not just pointing at governments, I'm also pointing at, when whatever sector you're in, if you're calling a country or doing business in a country that is high risk in terms of corruption of any form, then it is also your obligation to be prepared, know what those risks are. How do you plan for that? How do you embed whatever escalation channels, whatever procedures, whatever local assistance you might need? What did that look like? So that is, for me, how you get an anti-corruption policy into practice. And on the government side, I would say it's the same thing, right? When we analyzed or we've done like preparation for a country, we look at, what are the anti-corruption laws in the country and what are the other laws that may govern that business? And what we found in many times is that the laws are in place, but there are no, what we would call standard operating procedures, right? So you have a legal framework. And I normally use the example for, like, if you were a doctor, you have the health bill in many countries, but hospitals has a lot of procedures for how to do a surgery or how to document a patient, right? That would be the same thing, right? When a government officials interact with a business, if it is a tax audit or if they're coming on board the ships, that is something we've seen in a lot of times, that those practical procedures are often missing. Mm-hmm. And unless you don't have those practical procedures, it's really hard to challenge. I could give you an example. Are you allowed to come on 40 people on a ship and stay for that ship for 5 hours to find any type of deficiency? You don't see that happening elsewhere in the world. So it's not according to international standards, but it may not actually be something that is in the legal framework. So I think for that to really make sure there are practical procedures for how avoiding that wide discretionary power approach that we see happening in a lot of countries, right? Recognition, we all need each other. I mean, just pointing fingers at the private sector, pointing fingers at the government doesn't help us, right? We are here, we all have a responsibility to play, but no one has the responsibility to only, right? Like, we are here, it takes two to tango, and we need to move into a constructive dialogue quite quickly. Find ways to build trust. Even if there are procedures in place for the private sector, let's say there is a frontline employee of any sector that is faced with a corrupt demand. If there is complaint mechanisms or national channels, do they dare to report? Do they dare to escalate this within the authorities? So how do we build trust to actually use the measures so that, and I think I'm more alluding to like local players here, like local SMEs. If they're faced with a corrupt demand, if they have a tax audit or if they have something else, how do they escalate that? And how do they avoid that they individually or their company not being punished for it? The same goes to the government, right? How do you build trusted whistleblowing speak up systems? I think that is something where a lot of governments globally can do more, where I think the private sector has moved quite aggressively forward in having those formal speak up challenges. So how do you get incentives that empower people to say no? And where do you escalate that? If you're standing there and you report into an escalation mechanism and you hear back from the government in 6 months, no one's going to use that reporting mechanism ever again, right? So how do you create a practical dialogue between the government and the private sector so you can get solutions easy on the table quickly. That's how you incentivize companies to report back. That's how you would incentivize the government officials to take action, right? So I think that's just like, in terms of if I'm bucketing those three, I think definitely practical from policy to procedure, I think is really, really important here. Build trust mechanisms that runs effectively, that are working, that avoids retaliation and punishment from any side, right? Both in terms of the government's own channels, but also in terms of how you report into the government if you've been faced with any type of demand, right? So that is, I think, my short summary. I think that can be applicable anywhere, but I definitely think that in combination with understanding the government's priorities, having governments analyzing why do we need this sector so bad? What can we do to kind of improve business development in that area that is ethical is also extremely important to tap into that.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. Thank you. And final question to you, John. From your immense experience in both the public and private sector, what lessons can you share with the rest of the world on what it takes to drive transformational change in a public sector company to deliver returns for the shareholders and value to citizens? Because, you know, we keep saying for the private sector, you know, the purpose of a business is to realize returns for its shareholders, you know, while being mindful of all the other stakeholder needs. What does it take? What does it take to drive transformational change?
Clarity of purpose, very clear mind as to what you are trying to achieve, very clear goals. And I'm repeating quite a bit of what I had said earlier. Political support, not general, political and bureaucratic support, not general, but from people, those key people whose assistance or lack of opposition will open the way for you to do things. An extremely thick skin. This is rough business. This is extremely rough business. A clear plan, making it up as you go along will just not build any longevity or sustainability in what you are trying to do. And finally, results. Nothing speaks better than actually coming out with results which can be attributed to a wider circle of people, especially their decision makers, and they own it, and therefore they feel they have to sustain this success because it is identified with them. I know I say finally, but I think that there is one last one which is not taught, which is street smarts. Again, I repeat, these are very tough, very rough, very devious waters that one is paddling or swimming in, and you do need street smarts. Innocence will just not work, and I've seen this with expatriates, for example, brought into Kenya to drive.
Technology hasn't been with us today.
No, it hasn't. But that's good. I think, you know, the street smartness is key, you know, as a final note. And thank you so much. Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much to each and every one of you. Cecilia, thank you. And Mr. Kimil, it's been a wonderful session. I have learned so much. I've written down a few notes in terms of things that I need to factor into a couple of collective action initiatives I'm engaged in at the moment. Thank you all for joining us today. as we have, spent some time discussing collective action against corruption in Africa. I think you will agree with me that it's been a very insightful session. It's been a great learning session. And, just in terms of really consolidating upon some of the things we knew, but probably couldn't quite articulate it. Cecilia, you've helped very much, and John, in making things a lot clearer. Mr. Kimel, we're really looking forward to working with the AUABC on how we can take some of these collective initiatives across Africa forward. I would like to thank the UN Global Compact and the Global Compact's local networks in South Africa, in Kenya, in Ghana, in the DRC, Mauritius, and Indian Ocean, Nigeria, Tanzania, and Morocco for hosting this fantastic event. Once again, I am Ayatollah Jagun, and this has been Anti-Corruption and Good Governance at Making Global Goals Local Business Africa. Thank you. Excellence.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for a lovely session. Thank you.
Look forward to, we will tidy up the recording, I'm sure, so that it's a lot smoother. And I think what I will do is have a separate session with A.L. Kitenge and merge that into our recording. Yeah. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Nice to meet everybody in the call. Very interesting discussions.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.